They ridiculed him for adopting a black child. But years later, they pleaded for his assistance. Welcome, dear listeners. Today, we embark on a heartfelt journey through the charming town of Silverwood, where one man's courageous decision to adopt a child leads to profound changes, not just in his life, but in the very fabric of his community. Join us as we explore love, resilience, and the power of connection in the quiet town of Silverwood, nestled between rolling hills and sprawling meadows. Dr. David Morgan was known as a highly skilled and compassionate surgeon. His colleagues admired him, his patients trusted him, and the townsfolk held him in high regard. Silverwood was the kind of place where people prided themselves on tradition and familiarity, where community meant everything, and change was often met with suspicion. But Dr. Morgan's story was about to challenge these deeply held beliefs. It was a late autumn night when David's life took an unexpected turn. After a demanding 12-hour shift, he stepped out of Silverwood General Hospital, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs and ease the weight of his day. He was used to the long hours and the physical toll his work took on him. But this night held a different kind of exhaustion. As he made his way toward the parking lot, fumbling for his car keys, a faint cry cut through the silence. At first, David thought he might be imagining it, but the sound came again, soft and urgent. Curiosity mingled with concern as he followed the sound around a corner near the emergency entrance. There, under a dim streetlight, he found a small bundle wrapped in a worn blanket, barely moving but unmistakably alive. David's heart skipped a beat as he crouched down, gently pulling back the blanket. A pair of wide, curious eyes looked up at him, and in that instant, David felt an unexplainable connection. The child's tiny fingers clutched weakly at the fabric, and David's heart ached at the thought of this little one left alone in the cold night. Who could abandon such a fragile life? With the utmost care, David scooped the child into his arms, cradling the baby close to his chest, as if sensing the warmth and safety. The baby's cries softened, and he nuzzled into David's shoulder, a quiet sigh escaping his small lips. David felt a sense of purpose, a calling he had never anticipated. Without hesitation, David turned back toward the hospital, his thoughts racing as he walked through the doors. He could already feel a new chapter of his life unfolding, though he didn't fully understand it yet. The hospital staff quickly took the child in, performing the necessary tests and trying to find any information about the parents. Hours passed, and as the first light of dawn crept through the hospital windows, a social worker arrived with somber news. "No one's come forward," she explained gently. "If no one claims him, he'll be placed in the system." David's heart tightened at the thought of this child, this innocent life, moving from one place to another, without stability or a true home. The idea troubled him deeply. He glanced over at the child, sleeping peacefully in the nursery, and made a decision he hadn't anticipated. "I'll take him," David said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'll adopt him." The social worker looked surprised, as did a few of the nearby nurses who had overheard his declaration. Silverwood was a small town, and adoption, especially for a single man like David, was practically unheard of. But David knew. In that moment, he was certain this child needed a home, and David had love to give. News of Dr. David Morgan's decision to adopt spread quickly through Silverwood. The town was small, and stories like these didn't stay quiet for long. Before the week was out, whispers filled the corners of the local diner, the post office, and the neighborhood grocery. People who had once only spoken of David's skill as a surgeon now exchanged glances of surprise and even disapproval. David was no stranger to the gossip. He'd grown up in Silverwood, and he knew the townsfolk's way of sticking to what was familiar. But this time, it felt different. This time, the murmurs seemed sharper, more judgmental. Even his family found it difficult to fully understand his decision. One evening, David's parents, William and Eleanor Morgan, invited him over for dinner. Their warm, inviting home, where he had grown up, surrounded by fond memories, now felt different as he sat at the dining table. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as his parents exchanged concerned glances. His father, a man of few words, was the first to speak. "David," he began, clearing his throat, "we're just concerned about this decision. Taking on a child is no small thing." David nodded, choosing his words carefully. "I know it's a big commitment, Dad, but the moment I held him, I felt a bond one can't explain. He needs someone, and I want to be there for him." Eleanor reached across the table, resting her hand gently on David's. "Honey, we understand that. But you work such long hours at the hospital. You're a single man. Have you thought about how you're going to manage all of this?" David met her gaze, a mixture of love and frustration in his eyes. "I have. It won't be easy, but I'm determined. This little boy needs a stable home, and I want to be the one to give him that." His father shook his head slowly, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "David, you're not thinking about what this means. The town people will talk. They might not understand." David's jaw tightened as he absorbed his father's words. He had known this would be challenging, but he hadn't anticipated such hesitation from his own family. Taking a steadying breath, he spoke with quiet conviction. "I know it won't be easy, but he deserves a chance at a good life. And if people can't accept that, then that's on them. I'm doing what I feel is right." A silence hung over the table, filled with unspoken worries and fears. Finally, Eleanor gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "We just want what's best for you," she whispered, her voice laced with emotion. David smiled softly, understanding their concerns, but unmoved in his resolve. "I know, but please trust that this is what's best for me and for him." Leaving that evening, David knew he would face many challenges in the days to come, yet his heart remained steadfast. He was ready to give this child a home, no matter the hurdles that lay ahead. Within days, it seemed as though every corner of Silverwood had an opinion on David Morgan's choice to adopt. The whispers trailed him wherever he went. At the grocery store, he noticed people casting curious glances in his direction. At Mabel's diner, where locals usually exchanged friendly greetings, conversation would hush as soon as he entered. Even his patients at the hospital looked at him a little differently, their faces flickering between admiration and bewilderment. It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling, but David had learned to brush off the comments. What mattered to him now was Ben, the little boy he was bringing home. Ben was only a few months old and completely unaware of the world's complexities. To him, the world was simply a place of warmth, safety, and the gentle voice of the man who held him close. In those quiet moments, David felt a peace he hadn't known before, a sense of purpose that nothing could shake. But not everyone understood this newfound bond. One morning, as David made his way through the hospital corridors, he felt a shift in the air. Colleagues he had worked alongside for years now looked at him differently. A few whispered in passing, and their words, though quiet, were sharp enough to reach his ears. "Is he really fit to operate with a newborn at home?" Someone murmured. "And on his own, no less." David's face grew hot with a mix of frustration and sadness. He had always taken pride in his work, giving his all to every patient, every procedure. Yet now, some doubted his abilities simply because he had chosen to care for a child. He brushed off their words, reminding himself why he had made this choice. But the sting of judgment lingered, a subtle wound that cut deeper than he let on. That night, after a particularly long shift, David returned home to the sound of soft whimpers from Ben's crib. Exhaustion weighed on him, but as he looked at the tiny face peering up at him, his weariness melted away. Scooping Ben into his arms, he whispered gently, "Daddy's here." Ben cooed in response, his small fingers reaching out to touch David's face. In that moment, David knew that no amount of gossip or judgment could shake his commitment to this child. He had chosen this path not out of impulse, but out of a deep, unexplainable connection. Every time he held Ben, every time he soothed his cries, he was reminded of the bond they shared, one that went beyond words. As the days went by, David's life fell into a rhythm. He learned to balance his demanding work hours with sleepless nights and early morning feedings. It wasn't easy, but with each small step, he felt himself growing into this new role. In those quiet hours, when the town was asleep, It was just him and Ben, and that was enough. Silverwood could say what it liked. David had found a sense of belonging that no one could take away. One crisp Sunday morning, David decided to take Ben for a walk through Silverwood Park. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot, painting the paths in shades of amber and red. David pushed Ben's stroller slowly, savoring the fresh air and the warmth of the sunlight. For a brief moment, he felt at ease, distanced from the whispers and judgments that had followed him since his decision to adopt. As they strolled along the path, David noticed familiar faces passing by, neighbors, friends, even some of his patients. Most offered polite nods, but a few averted their gaze, their expressions tight with disapproval. David tried to focus on the simple joy of being out with Ben, pointing out squirrels and colorful leaves. Even as the tension around him pressed in, halfway through their walk, a sharp voice broke the peace. "Dr. Morgan," called Mrs. Dempsey, Silverwood's librarian. She was standing with Mr. Keller from the hardware store, both of them watching him with furrowed brows. David's stomach tensed, but he stopped, offering a polite nod. "Good morning." Mrs. Dempsey's lips pursed tightly. "We've been meaning to talk to you." "Doctor," she began, her voice laced with a mixture of concern and reproach. "This whole situation, it's not what we're used to in Silverwood." David's grip on the stroller handle tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "What situation would that be?" Mr. Keller cleared his throat. "Well, it's just raising a child on your own, with the kind of schedule you keep. It seems difficult, even risky." David took a steadying breath, fighting to keep his voice level. "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you, Ben is well cared for." Mrs. Dempsey shook her head, her expression softening slightly but still marked by disapproval. "Dr. Morgan, it's not just about care. It's about, well, what's best for him. You're a doctor. You know how important a stable environment is." David looked down at Ben, who was happily cooing and reaching for a fallen leaf inside his stroller. "I do know," he replied quietly, feeling a swell of protectiveness rise within him. "And that's exactly what I'm giving him, a stable, loving home." A small crowd had gathered by now, their gazes heavy with curiosity and judgment. David felt the weight of their stares, each one pressing down on him. But as he looked at Ben's innocent face, he found strength. What Ben needs is love, care, and consistency, David said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "And I can provide that." Mrs. Dempsey's expression hardened, but before she could respond, an elderly woman in the crowd stepped forward. "And I, for one, think it's admirable," she said firmly, casting a reproachful glance at Mrs. Dempsey. "This man is giving a child a home. Isn't that what matters?" The crowd murmured, a mix of agreement and lingering doubt. David offered the woman a grateful smile before turning back to the path, pushing Ben's stroller forward with renewed determination. Silverwood might not understand his choice, but he wasn't seeking their approval. For now, as autumn deepened, David settled into his new life with Ben, learning the rhythm of fatherhood one small moment at a time. The mornings were filled with soft coos and giggles, and the evenings with bedtime stories whispered in the glow of a nightlight. David cherished these routines, finding a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. Yet, the pressure from the town's skepticism remained a steady undercurrent, surfacing in unexpected moments. One evening, David received a call from Silverwood Elementary's principal, Mrs. Thompson. Though Ben was still far too young for school, Mrs. Thompson wanted to discuss the town's concerns. As he listened to her, David felt the familiar twinge of frustration, but agreed to meet her the next day. The following morning, he sat across from Mrs. Thompson in her modest office, her face a mask of polite concern. She offered him tea, which he declined, feeling the weight of the conversation ahead. "Dr. Morgan," she began with a sympathetic smile, "I want you to know that we all respect what you've done. Ben is lucky to have you." David nodded, bracing himself. "But," she continued, "some of the parents here are worried. They wonder if a single parent with a demanding job can provide the consistency a child needs. And they feel strongly about maintaining a certain stability in the community." David's jaw tightened. He'd prepared himself for judgment, but it was still difficult to hear it articulated so plainly. "I understand that people may have reservations," he replied calmly, "but I'm committed to Ben, to his well-being and happiness. He's my son in every way that matters." Mrs. Thompson shifted in her seat, her gaze softening. "I don't doubt your love for him, Dr. Morgan, but it's a small town. People have certain expectations, and change can be unsettling for them. We've had discussions, you might say." David could feel the weight of the town pressing in on him, an invisible but persistent force. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Ben deserves a chance to grow up in a safe, loving home. That's what I'm giving him. Whatever people think, that's not going to change." Mrs. Thompson sighed, perhaps realizing that David's resolve was unbreakable. "I understand, Dr. Morgan, and I appreciate you coming to talk about it. I truly do hope things will settle in time." David rose, offering a polite nod. "Thank you for letting me know. I want what's best for Ben, and, frankly, that's all I'm focused on." Leaving the school, he couldn't help but feel the tension that still lingered in the air. Silverwood was his home, but it was also a place rooted in tradition and conformity. Yet as he walked back to his car, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, he would face them with strength. Ben deserved nothing less, and David was determined to be the father Ben needed, come what may. David's days soon became a delicate balancing act. With Ben at the center of it all, he'd rush through his morning rounds at the hospital, his mind always half focused on the clock, counting down the hours until he could return home. His colleagues noticed his exhaustion. The dark circles under his eyes and his occasional missed lunch breaks were hard to ignore. But David didn't care. For him, those precious hours with Ben made every challenge worthwhile. One particularly hectic day, just as David was wrapping up a long shift, his phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Callahan, a kindly elderly woman who often helped watch Ben when his schedule was tight. Her voice was filled with worry. "Dr. Morgan, Ben's been a bit fussy today," she said. "I tried feeding him, but he just seems uncomfortable. He keeps tugging at his ear." David's heart sank. He'd been around enough young patients to recognize the signs of an ear infection, and though he knew it was a common ailment, the thought of his son in pain left him feeling helpless. "I'll be there as soon as I can, Mrs. Callahan," he replied, already gathering his things and hurrying out of the hospital. As he drove home, his mind raced with concerns. He knew the medical steps to take, of course, but it was different when it was his own child. A sense of urgency drove him as he pulled up to the house, his heart beating fast. When he walked through the door, Ben's cries filled the room, high and insistent. Mrs. Callahan looked up, relief evident in her eyes. "Thank goodness you're here, Dr. Morgan. I think he just needs his dad." David immediately scooped Ben into his arms, holding him close and whispering soothing words. Gradually, Ben's cries softened, his small hand clutching David's shirt as he settled against his father's shoulder. Feeling the weight of his son's tiny body, David was overwhelmed with a mix of love and worry. After giving Ben some medicine and rocking him gently, David felt his son's tense little body finally relax, his breathing slowing into sleep. David sat in the nursery for a long time, simply holding him, letting the quiet of the moment wash over them. For all the questions and doubts people had thrown his way, this was what mattered. These were the moments that defined their bond. By the time he laid Ben down in his crib, the house was dark, and David's exhaustion was bone deep. Yet, as he looked down at Ben, now peacefully asleep, he felt a sense of fulfillment that erased the day's hardships. He knew that he would do anything for this child, face any struggle, and weather any judgment. In the quiet of that evening, David made a promise to himself and to Ben. He would always be there, no matter what. He would be both a father and a protector, giving Ben a life filled with love, safety, and unwavering support. As the seasons turned and winter settled over Silverwood, David found comfort in the routine he had established with Ben. The snowy days brought a special magic. filling the town with the soft hush of falling snowflakes and the joyful sounds of children playing outside. David bundled Ben up in layers of warm clothing and took him out for walks, watching as his son's eyes widened at the beauty of their winter wonderland. One Saturday afternoon, David decided to take Ben to the park, where families gathered to enjoy the snow. As he pushed the stroller through the freshly fallen snow, he felt a sense of pride. He had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and whispers that still followed him. But today, he was focused on making memories with his son. They arrived at the park, where laughter and joy filled the air. Children built snowmen, their cheeks rosy from the cold, while parents smiled and exchanged pleasantries. David watched as Ben's tiny hands reached out, fascinated by the white flakes landing on his nose and eyebrows. David couldn't help but laugh at the adorable sight. As he set up a small blanket on the ground to give Ben a soft place to sit, David noticed a group of mothers nearby. They were chatting, and at first, he tried to ignore them, but their laughter soon faded into whispers as they spotted him. He could feel their eyes on him, a familiar weight that had become somewhat of a constant companion. "Is that the doctor who adopted?" one of them murmured, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "Isn't it strange?" another replied, her tone tinged with skepticism. A single man raising a child like that. What was he thinking? David tightened his grip on Ben's stroller, his heart racing. But before he could let the judgment affect him, Ben squealed in delight, reaching for a nearby snowman. David smiled, kneeling down to show his son the wonder of the world around him. "Look, Ben, isn't he a good one?" Ben giggled, his laughter breaking through the icy air and warming David's heart. In that moment, the noise around them faded, and all that mattered was the joy of his son's laughter. A few moments later, to David's surprise, one of the mothers approached him. Her expression was soft, lacking the hostility he had braced himself for. "He's adorable," she said, gesturing to Ben. "You're doing a great job." David blinked in surprise, not expecting such kindness amidst the judgmental atmosphere. "Thank you," he replied, feeling a rush of warmth at her words. "You know," she continued, her voice gaining confidence, "I can only imagine how difficult it must be. But my sister adopted, and I've seen the love it brings." A flicker of hope ignited in David's heart. "It is challenging," he admitted, "but every day is worth it." As they spoke, the air shifted. Other mothers who had been watching now joined the conversation, offering smiles and words of encouragement. David felt a subtle change in the atmosphere, as if the barriers that had separated them were beginning to dissolve. Perhaps there was room for understanding, for community, even in a town like Silverwood. In that moment, as he watched Ben play with the snow and laugh with glee, David realized that love could bridge the gaps that prejudice tried to create. And together, they were starting to rewrite the narrative, not just for themselves, but for the community around them. As the winter months rolled on, Silverwood began to experience a transformation. The initial shock of David's decision to adopt Ben was slowly fading, replaced by a cautious acceptance from some members of the community. More and more people were willing to engage with David and his son, often stopping him in the street or at the local market to share a kind word. However, the change was not universal. David was still aware of the whispers, the lingering doubts among others who held tightly to their preconceived notions. But he chose to focus on the positive interactions, cherishing the warmth that came from unexpected friendships. One afternoon, as David returned home from the hospital, he noticed a crowd gathered outside Silverwood's community center. Curious, he stepped out of his car and made his way over. Ben nestled snugly in his arms. As he approached, he realized that a winter festival was underway, a celebration meant to bring the town together during the cold season. Families laughed, children played, and the scent of hot cocoa wafted through the air. "Hey, Dr. Morgan," called out Tom, the local mechanic, waving him over with a grin. "Come join us. There's plenty of food and activities for the kids." David hesitated for a moment, but the warmth in Tom's voice urged him on. "Sure, thank you," he replied, smiling as he moved closer. Setting Ben down, David watched as his son's eyes lit up with excitement at the sight of a snowman building competition. He felt a swell of happiness at the sight of Ben's enthusiasm. It was a reminder that, despite the challenges, he was providing a joyful environment for his child. As David and Ben joined the festivities, he found himself chatting with other parents. Some had expressed reservations in the past, but today they seemed genuinely interested in Ben. They laughed and played alongside the children, their barriers slowly crumbling in the face of shared joy. "Look at him go!" one mother exclaimed as Ben stumbled into a pile of snow, giggling uncontrollably. "He's having the time of his life." "He really is," David replied, beaming with pride. "He loves the snow." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the scene, David felt a profound sense of belonging wash over him. It was as though, for the first time, the community was beginning to see Ben as simply a child, not a reflection of David's choices. After some time, Tom approached David again, a more serious look on his face. "You know, I've been thinking about how we've treated you," he said, his tone earnest. "I want you to know that I respect what you're doing. Raising Ben is a big deal, and you're doing a great job." David's heart warmed at Tom's words. "Thank you, Tom. That means a lot," he replied, feeling the weight of isolation lift slightly. As the festival continued, laughter and chatter filled the air, and David felt hopeful. Perhaps Silverwood was on a path to embracing change, slowly learning to look past the surface and recognize the humanity in each other. For the first time since he had adopted Ben, David truly believed that love and community could prevail, transforming not just his life, but the lives of those around him. The winter festival brought with it a renewed spirit in Silverwood, and as David watched Ben play with other children, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The laughter, the camaraderie, and the simple joy of community were all around him, and for the first time, he felt a part of it in a way that transcended the whispers and doubts that had once clouded his experience. However, beneath this wave of positivity, a storm was brewing. The following week, an unexpected health crisis struck the town. Children began falling ill with alarming symptoms: high fevers, fatigue, and in some cases, difficulty breathing. Panic rippled through the community as parents hurried their children to the hospital. Fearing the worst, David's phone rang incessantly, and he found himself back in the hospital, just as he had been countless times before, but this time with a knot of worry tightening in his stomach. As the emergency room filled with frightened parents and sick children, David's heart raced. He rushed from bed to bed, checking on his young patients, offering reassurance as best he could. Each time he met the eyes of a parent, he saw the same desperation reflected back at him, the fear of losing a child. It was a familiar fear, one he had felt himself, and it filled him with resolve to find answers. Dr. Stevens, his supervisor, was already on high alert, coordinating with the nursing staff as they dealt with the influx of patients. "David, we need to figure out what's causing this," he said, urgency lining his voice. "The symptoms are spreading rapidly, and we can't identify the source." As the days wore on, the situation became more dire. The hospital was stretched to its limits, and the gravity of the crisis weighed heavily on David's shoulders. He pored over patient files late into the night, trying to find a common link among the cases. The fatigue was relentless, but the thought of Ben kept him focused. He needed to find a solution, not just for his patients, but for all the children in Silverwood. Finally, after several sleepless nights, David had a breakthrough. He recalled the recent changes in the community and the water supply, noting that the illness coincided with heavy rainfall and flooding in the area. What if the illness was linked to the local water sources? With this theory in mind, David called for a meeting with Dr. Stevens and the other staff members. "I believe we need to investigate the water supply. There might be a contamination issue that could be making our children sick," he suggested, urgency ringing in his voice. Dr. Stevens nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Let's start by analyzing the water samples from the community. We need to act fast." The hospital staff rallied together, and David felt a surge of determination. He was not alone in this fight. As he delved into the investigation, his thoughts kept drifting back to Ben. He would do everything in his power to protect him and the other children. In the face of this crisis, love would guide him, and he was resolute in his mission to keep Silverwood safe. With a renewed sense of purpose, David led the charge to investigate the potential contamination of Silverwood's water supply. Working alongside Dr. Stevens and the rest of the hospital staff, they mobilized resources quickly, gathering samples from various sources around town. As the team tested the water, David's mind raced with possibilities, wondering how long it would take to identify the root of the problem. Days turned into a blur of lab work and patient care. The atmosphere in the hospital was heavy with anxiety, but David felt a spark of hope as initial results began to come in. There were signs of unusual contaminants, which could potentially be linked to the symptoms the children were experiencing. But the data needed to be verified, and time was running out. One evening, after another long day filled with consultations and testing, David returned home to find Ben asleep in his crib. The sight of his son, peaceful and innocent, reminded him of why he was fighting so hard. He gently placed his hand on Ben's forehead, brushing aside a stray curl. In that moment, he felt a wave of love wash over him, mingled with the urgency of their situation. As he settled into a chair next to Ben's crib, David reflected on the changes that had swept through Silverwood over the past few months. He could see the community beginning to come together, united in their concern for the children's well-being. There was a growing recognition that they needed to face the crisis collectively, setting aside their differences. The next morning brought promising news. The lab had confirmed that the water supply was contaminated with a substance known to cause severe gastrointestinal issues and respiratory symptoms in children. Armed with this information, David and Dr. Stevens prepared to address the community. They organized a town meeting at the community center, where they could share their findings and recommend immediate precautions. As the meeting room filled with anxious parents and concerned townsfolk, David stood at the front, heart pounding. He felt the weight of their expectations and fears pressing down on him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We have identified the source of the illness affecting our children. It appears the water supply has been contaminated." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, and David held up his hand to maintain order. "We are working on solutions to rectify the contamination, but in the meantime, I urge you all to avoid drinking tap water. Bottled water is available at the community center, and we're coordinating to ensure that everyone has access." As he continued to explain the steps being taken, he noticed the expressions in the room beginning to shift. What had once been skepticism and doubt transformed into gratitude and solidarity. Families began to lean closer, listening intently as David spoke about the importance of coming together in the face of adversity. After the meeting, parents approached David, their eyes filled with gratitude. One mother, tears in her eyes, said, "Thank you, Dr. Morgan. We couldn't have done this without you." As David left the community center, he felt a wave of hope wash over him. For the first time since adopting Ben, he sensed a real change in Silverwood, an awakening to the power of love, empathy, and community. Together, they would face this crisis, and in doing so, they were forging a new bond, one built on understanding and support. David knew that he and Ben were not just surviving. They were becoming part of something larger, something meaningful. Thank you for joining us on this inspiring journey through Silverwood, where love and resilience triumphed over adversity. David and Ben's story reminds us of the transformative power of empathy and community. We hope it touched your heart and encouraged you to embrace compassion in your own lives. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Together, we can continue to spread messages of hope and connection. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the goodness of people.